So I'm very happy to introduce our speakers today, Raffaella Vassena and Damiano Rebecchini, both from the University of Milan, and they're co-editors of the 2-volume book, Reading Russia. Today, they're going to present the 2nd volume of this book, which focuses on the long 19th century, 1800 to 1917. And these volumes, as I understand it, are one of the outcomes of a series of conferences, one of which I participated in long ago. And it seems like those gatherings have generated a really productive conversation, and we're excited to hear about it. And I'd also like to introduce our subsiednik, Yukiko Tatsumi, from the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. So thank you very much. Oh, and one thing, please do remember everyone to speak slowly. Если хотите, говорите, пожалуйста, по-русски. Спасибо всем.
Thank you, Annie. First of all, I would like to thank the Jordan Center, Sarah Dickinson, and Sasha Spitalnik, and all the organizer of the seminar for giving us this opportunity to talk about our book. And I saw among the public there are some authors, so I hope they will participate actively in the discussion. So Reading Russia is an editorial project that has involved some 30 scholars over several years, with the ambitious aim of achieving a history of reading in Russia. The first volume covers the period between the 17th and the 18th centuries. The second volume, which we are presenting today, focuses on reading in the 19th century, while the third covers the period from the Bolshevik Revolution up to the present day. The volumes are open access, and for those of you who are interested, we will include the link for downloading the volumes in the chat. Our aim was ambitious, and of course, we couldn't devote the same degree of attention to every aspect of the study of reading in the 19th century. For example, we have not devoted much space to reading among the Russian Empire's linguistic or religious minorities. In general, insufficient space has been given to reading religious text or spiritual literature. In this presentation, Raffaella and I will focus on 2 aspects of reading novels in the 19th century. Raffaella will tell us about the sources used by the authors of the book, and she will reflect on what these sources can and what they cannot tell us about reading novels. I will reflect on a different issue, namely why it is important to examine the readers of the past to understand 19th century Russian novels and Russian literature. So, Raffaella.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I would like to offer a few general thoughts on the sources available to us for a history of reading in Russia in the 19th century, focusing on 2 kinds in particular. The contributors to our 3 volumes on reading in Russia avail themselves of various types of sources, depending on the object of their analysis and the aspects of the reading matters consumption that most interested them. The temporal division of the volumes into 4 parts shows quite effectively how the predominance of one kind of source over another coincided with significant moments in the history of Russian culture and society, and reflects to a certain extent the behavior, spaces, and habits in which the reading practices of interpretive communities in a given epoch are, so to speak, made flesh. What then would the ideal sources be for a history of reading in 19th century Russia? Over the last 40 years, many of them have underpinned the key studies by Abraham Reitblatt, Jeffrey Brooks, and others in this area. What do they still have to say to us about what the Russians read, and what other sources still remain to be discovered and interpreted? The sources used by the authors of our 2nd volume were many and various, sometimes leaning towards a quantitative analysis, sometimes a qualitative analysis of reading. From the urban graphosphere to the marginalia, bookmarks, jottings in private albums, and recorded quotations during the golden age and silver age of Russian poetry. From private library and public reading room catalogs to the subscription lists of literary journals and books, from sociological surveys of reading in the countryside to the minutes of commissions for the creation of a new regional periodicals, from the recurrence of given text in school syllabuses, in lists of recommended books and in anthologies, to the censor's reports on literary works, or again, the paratextual characteristics of published matter in the second part of the 19th century, without forgetting such valuable resources as diaries, letters, and memoirs. It goes without saying that, depending on the source used, different, sometimes contradictory features of reading come to the fore. If some of the sources cast light on the regulatory, even disciplining function, the state or dominant ideology expected of reading, others portray it as an emancipatory, at times subversive activity. As we know, some of these sources are more accessible than others, thanks above all to the digitalization of many archive holdings and the continual updating of the main Russian electronic libraries. For all their manifest diversity, each of these sources can give us an idea of who Russian readers were in the 19th century and what they read. But what can they tell us of how they read, and in particular, how they read novels, or of the extent of their involvement not only with text, but also with authors? And conversely, what can these sources not tell us? Generally speaking, what emerges from our volume is that in both the high summers of Russian poetry at the beginning of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries, the available sources testify to an extraordinary emotional complicity between authors and readers. As Daria Kitrova highlights in her contribution, with their underlinings, inscriptions, comments, quotations, and copying into private diaries or albums to be shared with family and friends, the noble readers of the Golden Age performed on the template created by the poet, personalizing it and enriching it with new contents and meanings. Similarly, Jonathan Stone and Raman Timianchik, exploring sources such as readers' letters to the symbolist poets or readers' transcriptions of their favorite poems, demonstrate how the modernist reader aspired to be more than a passive recipient, but almost the co-author of symbolist text. With the popularization of the novel in the 1830s and 40s, this emotional complicity seems to have gradually faded. Literature and reading emerges from the circumscribed confines of literary clubs and salons and begins to reach ever wider sections of society. As Damiano Rebecchini and Abraham Reitblatt show in their studies, the spread of education and the consequent expansion of the book market went hand in hand with the proliferation of public libraries and reading rooms, as publishers responded to a demand which assumed increasingly mass market proportions. And it is precisely this mass aspect which seems to determine a gradual distancing of readers from writers, to some extent reflected too in the kinds of sources which are available to us in this period. The landing records of the libraries and subscriptions, both to books and to the Tolstoy Journali, though very useful for establishing links between literary genres and social classes, nonetheless furnish reader profiles that, if not quite anonymous, are nonetheless lacking in the specific individual traits that had distinguished them up until a few decades earlier. The veil of reader anonymity can, it is true, be penetrated by such sources as private library catalogs, which certainly contribute to tracing the profile of a single reader, but pose obvious accessibility problems. This is a source that Galavina draws on in her contribution, where she examines the role of literature in the life of a family of small landowners in the province of Vladimir in the 1830s and 1840s. One thing her study shows is that when it is possible to cross-reference this type of source with others, such as diaries and letters, singular cases can come to light that testify to extraordinary levels of involvement of some readers with novels. Galavina shows that romantic and sentimental texts in particular profoundly influenced their vision of the world, shaped their values and emotions, educated their aesthetic and critical sensibilities. This sort of source can similarly be cross-referenced with others again. Some of our authors have looked into how books were produced, others into how they were distributed by taking into account, for example, the price of books or of subscriptions to a Tolstoy journal, yet other into how they were taught. With regard to book production, I would like to focus briefly on the physical characteristics of an edition, generally all the elements that Gerard Genet includes in his concept of paratext, as a source that can tell us a lot about the kind of reader it is aimed at. As Roger Chartier and Donald Mackenzie's studies have demonstrated, it is possible by studying the forms of a text transmission to reconstruct its life over time, showing how the move from one publishing format to another can signal a change in the social and cultural background of its public, the uses to which a text is put, and its possible interpretations. According to their outward characteristics, differing editions can, on the one hand, create or fail to create a new public and prompt unexpected appropriations. This emerges with particular clarity from the 1870s onwards, when the appearance of new publishing initiatives, such as series, paperbacks, or illustrated weekly magazines, encouraged a much wider circulation of the classics, often in versions adapted for a popular readership or children. The analysis of Dostoevsky's posthumous editions, for example, in my chapter, shows how publishing functioned as a reinterpretation of Dostoevsky's works, opening the way to new hermeneutic categories, enriching the writer's public image with unexpected nuances and extending the social and generational range of his readership. Dostoevsky's editorial policy, pursuing the goal of greater dissemination of her husband's works, and meanwhile adjusting to the changes in Russian social context, ended up widening the spectrum of possible interpretations of Dostoevsky's work, thus interfering to a certain extent with the official reading of Dostoevsky as a patriot and a conservative writer. The second source, which I would like to focus on, is letters, or the so-called fan mail, readers' letters to writers. This can be quite exceptional testimonies, largely unpublished and therefore, for the most part, unexplored. And we are not talking of the 19th century, not only talking of the 19th century here. As Timienchik notes in his chapter, whole swaths of as yet unanalyzed letters from readers to Alexander Blok and Valery Brusov remain preserved, as do later letters from the 50s and 60s to Anna Akhmatova. Letters from so-called common readers to writers form a source with quite specific features, one which emerges with particular clarity at the precise moment in Russian literary history, starting in the 60s with a notable increase from the second half of the 1870s onwards. We do, in fact, find traces of a similar practice in the first half of the century, but to a lesser extent and with rather different characteristics. We know, for example, that the editors of the Tolstoy Giornali would receive correspondence from their subscribers, though not a lot of this has come down to us. And we also know that a writer like Gogol was so keen to establish a relationship with his public that he addressed the readers of Dead Souls directly, inviting them to correct it. If Gogol's seeking this kind of co-authorship with his public demonstrates a desire on the part of an 1840s writer to re-establish that emotional complicity with the reader that seems to have been lost with the advent of the novel, the letters from readers to literati in the 60s and 70s testify to not only a willingness, but even a burgeoning need on the reader's part to enter into a genuine communion with the writer. Why at this period particularly? As similar cases in France and in England show, this has to do, on the one hand, with the evolution of the genre of the novel, in particular for the Russian context, with the rise of the realistic novel, and on the other, with the consecration of the man of letters as a public authority. In the Russia of the Great Reforms, the writer was elevated to the status of public personality and role model for society, contributing to filling the void created by the collapse of the values and structures of the past. All at sea, the reader asked that literature represents real and authentic life. He actively sought a contact with the author, searching in him a moral authority capable of guiding the reader's life. So what can readers' letters bring to a history of reading? A series of methodological problems present themselves at the outset. Can such a source help to provide a general picture of the perception of literary works and the reading habits of different social classes, especially since the content of such letters rarely give us anything like a full range of physiological, mental, and emotional elements involved in the process of reading? Then again, not all writers receive letters from their readers. We know for sure that Dostoevsky and Tolstoy got them. The vast majority of letters to Tolstoy lie unexplored in his Moscow archive. Chekhov and Korolenko received them. So did Nekrasov, although largely on account of his position in the Literaturny Fond. It may be that Turgenev too got his share, above all in the last period of his life when his popularity reached unheard of levels. Insofar as it appears to have been a phenomenon that involved some writers and not others, it is plausible to see these letters as a more or less conscious response not only to an author's concerns, but also to the linguistic and compositional techniques of some of them, and perhaps not of others. Furthermore, readers' letters may not only represent a reaction sui generis to a text's mechanisms, but might even have influenced the writer's creative processes in that he could use them as a first-hand material for the construction of an ideal reader of his works. Readers' letters document not only and not always the relationship between a reader and the given text, but also the deep desire of certain readers to enter into communion with the author, to reestablish that emotional complicity which had been the prerogative of poetical text. These letters bear witness to the presumption of belonging to, or at least to the conscious attempt on the individual parts to join up with that community of readers addressed by an author through these works. The feeling of having entered into communion with Dostoevsky as the author of the Diary of a Writer, led some of these readers to develop a sort of symbiosis with his persona, which in many cases turned into a real cult. Among the readers of the Diary of a Writer, there were those who expected Dostoevsky to provide them with spiritual help, those who swore loyalty to him, those who showed fetishistic behaviors or mythomania, transposing autobiographical episodes reported in the Diary of a Writer into their own life, and even those who compared Dostoevsky to Christ or to a prophet, and the diary to the Holy Scriptures. This kind of letters can sometimes be of interest to the scholar independently of its content. The opening and closing formulae adopted, for example, or the presence or absence of a signature can say much about the kind of relationship the reader is hoping to establish with the writer. Perhaps more interesting still are those letters where readers disregard their norms of epistolary convention, letting their emotions get the better of their attention to formality. Also of significance in building in an identikit of the reader are the material aspects of the letter, the quality of paper, for example, or the handwriting, the envelope, and so on. Tolstoy, for example, admitted to a predilection for envelopes inscribed with crooked calligraphy and letters full of grammatical mistakes. To conclude, taking advantage of such primary resources as the readers' letters to writers, where they can be found, can be, in my opinion, a great help towards understanding the evolution of the status of the person of letters and the mental and emotional processes that underpin the formation of a certain image of the writer in the public perception, or at least in the perception of some groups of readers. Thank you, and Damiano.
Thank you, Raffaella. So now I will try to address the issue why it is important to examine the readers of the past to understand the 19th century Russian literature. In the 1980s, Robert Darnton and Roger Chartier successfully attracted the attention of numerous scholars to the history of reading. Reading has its own history, wrote Darnton. Understanding in which way people read in the past helps us to understand how they gave a sense to their lives, end quote. It seems that in Russia, attention was paid to the history of reading even earlier. At the beginning of the 20th century, several scholars, including Alexander Bieletsky, pondered on the importance of studying reading in order to understand the history of literature. In 1922, Bieletsky wrote, "Without a history of the reader, the history of literature has no solid basis. It is mutilated. However rigorous its conclusion may be, they are partial, and none of its period can be seriously evaluated." Now, we may wonder, why study 19th century readers in order to understand the Russian novels? And I can give you two reasons. Firstly, the reactions of the readers of the past help us to reconstruct the public's horizon of expectation. They reveal the most fashionable works, the most successful literary models, and the literary skills according to which the new Russian novels were assessed. The readers' comments show us what type of expectation Russian novelists had to anticipate. Via their comparison with other authors of the day, the readers of the past help us to reconstruct precisely the different horizons of expectation shared within different interpretive communities. Secondly, readers' reactions help us to grasp what is implicit in a literary text. Readers' comments reveal those aesthetic and ethical norms shared within a society or a certain group, and about which authors are well aware when writing a novel. Precisely because these norms are implicit in the text, today they often escape our notice. Let me give you a few examples of the public of Russian novels of the first half of the 19th century. On examining the Russian readers of the early 19th century, we realize what a real passion they had for foreign novels. Authors such as Kotzebue, Madame Cotten, Auguste Lafontaine, d'Arlencourt were widely translated, and the number of runs of their novels far exceeded those of the works of Derzhavin or of Karamzin. Among the bestsellers of the 1830s, we find the novels of an author today forgotten, namely Paul de Kock. Between 1832 and 1842, no fewer than 26 Paul de Kock novels were translated in Russian. Most of the Russian reading public of this period had read some of Paul de Kock novels. And yet, if we analyze the situation more carefully, we realize that within different groups, those readers did not actually read exactly the same text, and they often read them and understood them in very different ways. Let's take a look, for example, at the case of the Winter Palace readers in the 1830s. Observing the orders placed by the personal librarian to Tsar Nicholas I, we discovered that Paul de Kock's and Walter Scott's novels were among the Tsar's and his courtiers' favorites. At the same time, the borrowing register of the servants' library at the Winter Palace, which supplied some 700 readers, including footmen, doormen, bellboys, chefs, and stoker, revealed that those same Paul de Kock and Walter Scott novels, translated into Russian, were among those most frequently borrowed by these members of staff. The servants' passion for Paul de Kock novels was such that at a certain point, the librarian was forced to interrupt any further purchases so as to replace them with Russian novels that were considered less audacious. This fact could raise a few doubts about the sense of distinguishing a court culture at that time. And yet, the borrowing registers show that while the Tsar and the courtiers preferred certain Walter Scott and Paul de Kock titles, their servants preferred others by the same authors. While the Tsar read the French translation of Walter Scott, which had precise stylistic features, the servants read Russian translations with very different stylistic features. The court readers preferred evening salon readings with a large number of participants and frequent interruptions, whereas the daily life of the servants allowed for different reading practices. What changed significantly between the reading enjoyed by the courtiers and by their servants, in addition to the language, were their reading practices, their horizons of expectation, and the readers' interpretive skills. Although they often read the same novels, the reactions of different groups of readers to the same titles were very different. While contemporary French novels, such as those by Paul de Kock, were read by the courtiers after a quantity of French memoir about the French Revolution, and therefore tended to acquire special political significance, those same novels were projected by the servants against a fanciful, legendary background made up of their many readings of Lubbock romances such as Bova Karalievich, the picaresque or sentimental novels of the past decades, thereby having an escapist purpose, providing a diversion from their daily grind. So if we move out of the Winter Palace into the estates of two middling landowners situated about 50 miles northeast of Vladimir, we see that here as well Paul de Kock novels, along with those of Bulgarin, were among one of the landowners' favorites. The reading matter of these two ordinary provincial readers have been examined in our book by Tatiana Galavina, and judging by the reaction of these readers, we can appreciate what was so attractive in these novels. Paul de Kock novels were novels about contemporary France, often set in Paris, and with a large number of anecdotal and amusing events, with numerous slightly risque amorous adventures. Paul de Kock novels perfectly epitomized that acceptable limit of light and licentious comedy without offending the moral norms of the male readers of the day. As Dostoevsky novels are also testify, for several decades Paul de Kock's novels were targeted at an adult male audience. For instance, Makar Devushkin, for example, the hero of Poor Folks, told Varvara that his books are not suitable for you, end quote. 2 decades later, the noble Aglaya in The Idiot tells Mishkin about the quarrels she had had with her parents. And she had told them, quote, "I'm not a little girl anymore. And 2 years ago, I deliberately read 2 Paul de Kock novels precisely to find out everything. When Maman heard that, she almost fainted," end quote. Even after the 1860s, Paul de Kock was still almost exclusively read by men, but as Aglaya shows, the ethical norms shared in the world of the nobility were changing. If I insist on the moving confines of aesthetic and ethical norms shared with groups of different readers, it is because these confines and these norms were very clear to the Russian authors of the day. And it was with those norms that they played in their novels. When we look at the Russian literature, Russian fiction only began to enjoy widespread success in the mid-1820s at a time of economic expansion. The success of so many Russian novels dedicated to Russia's past helped to create a shared historical imagery composed for the most part of national stereotypes that reinforced a sense of cohesion among readers belonging to different social and cultural groups. While the first Russian historical novels contributed to an ideological standardization of the general public, the first great novels about contemporary Russia, such as Gogol's Dead Souls and Lermontov's A Hero of Our Time, had a strong divisive effect on the public. First published at the beginning of the 1840s at a time of great economic crisis, they contributed to accentuating the division within the reading public, to creating opposing communities of readers, and to radicalizing their ideological positions. At this stage, the generational differences within the Russian public were accentuated, while the social differences were attenuated. The success of the thick journals only accentuated this state of affairs. Describing the public of Dead Souls, Sergei Aksakov distinguished 3 different types of reactions from the readers. Quote, "The readers of Dead Souls can be divided into 3 groups. The first, which includes educated young people, welcomed it with enthusiasm. The second group is composed of people who found themselves slightly puzzled because they were used to being entertained by Gogol's works, and all of a sudden they failed to grasp the profound and serious meaning of his poem. The third group of readers were enraged by Gogol. They recognized themselves in various figures in the poem and were determined to defend all the Russians whom he had offended," end quote. In the next slide, you can see a series of reactions that confirm the picture described by Aksakov. In comparison with Paul de Kock's novel, numerous readers found events in Dead Soul tedious, and the description of daily life decidedly vulgar. At the same time, compared to Bulgarin's work, numerous provincial landowners who made up an important part of the Russian reading public found Gogol's novel particularly offensive. Judging by the perplexity or incomprehension expressed by his contemporary readers, today we can appreciate just what an aesthetic novelty Gogol's Poshlost was. At the same time, it is thanks to the infuriated reactions of the landowners that we can grasp the ideological potential of this novel. In 1843, Gogol replied as follows to the expectation of the public waiting for the second volume of Dead Souls. Quote, "It's not my fault if the public has a stupid head and equates me with Paul de Kock. Paul de Kock writes a novel a year, they say, and so why shouldn't I do the same? After all, it's a novel. I called it a poem just for a joke." One of the ways in which he had tried to counter the fictional expectation of his public had been to design the cover of his novel himself. Here, the fictional title, The Adventures of Yukiko, was decidedly marginalized, while the fact that the work is a poem, as you can see, is certainly not secondary. These paratext elements are so relevant because they guided the interpretation of the novel. While that so divided the public into groups that split mainly according to their geographical provenance, cultural background, and economic interests, Lermontov's A Hero of Our Time created a real generational split in the reading public by proposing a new sense of morality that was completely unacceptable for many readers of the older generation. We can see it even within the same social environment and the same family, within the imperial family. Maria Pavlovna, the Tsar's 54-year-old sister, compared Pichorin to Mephistopheles portrayed in Faust, and found that Lermontov's hero showed signs of an indifference of the soul. Tsar Nicholas, who was 44, compared it with the new French psychological novels, such as Musset, Mémoires d'un enfant du siècle, and found in Pichorin, quote, the same emphatic representation of those despicable and implausible characters populating contemporary foreign novels. He found Lermontov's novel repugnant, perfectly worthy of being in vogue. The Tsar considered that the real hero of our time in the novel should have been Maxim Maximich. Quote, when I started reading this novel, I rejoiced and hoped that he might just be the hero of our time, he wrote to his wife. His son, Konstantin Nikolaevich, who read it in those same months at the age of 18, found the novel interesting and enthralling, and was especially fascinating by the Caucasian setting. Another reader of the younger generation, a Kazan University student named Artemiev, found Pichorin a fascinating character precisely because he saw the sign of a new morality that had nothing to do with the one promoted by the Orthodox Church. As regards the conservatives' criticisms, he wrote, quote, they are afraid that once we have read Lermontov's book, we will become heroes of our time like Pichorin. And who are we supposed to be, Maxim Maximich? It seems to me that we need to keep up with our time rather than lag behind it, end quote. He concluded, A Hero of Our Time, at least for me, is much more of a moral work, even if it does not include very long religious prayers. I prefer to resemble Pichorin rather than to start praying somewhere in the street and being called a Bible basher. I would not really like to resemble the Pharisee from the Gospel. This is what I think of a hero of our time, end quote. At the same time, in the remote Siberian town of Irkutsk, where the pompous Marlinsky style was still fashionable, Lermontov's dry and cutting prose style seemed too spare and unsophisticated for those old-fashioned provincial readers. Quote, it is a good novel, but the writing is too simplistic. Publishing the diary of Vladimir Golitsyn, William Mills Todd has shown us how the prince in the English club in Moscow reads the chapters of Anna Karenina that came out in the Ruski Vestnik, comparing them mentally with the novels of another widely read but poorly studied French author, namely Octave Feuillet. Golitsyn finds Feuillet's novel not only more elegant but truer than that of Tolstoy, whose realism he finds repugnant. Golitsyn writes, quote, depravity has been taken by this novel to such a terrifying extent that it may brand society with the mark of disgrace and shame. In Anna Karenina, there is nothing resembles Feuillet's novel in elegance and truthfulness. And shortly after that, he adds, Anna Karenina continues to appear and continues to disturb me with its disgusting realism. Golitsyn's reactions, described in his diary, suggest exactly which scenes in Tolstoy's novel had a disturbing effect on readers like him. And it is not easy for us today to grasp so precisely the aesthetic effect of each individual scene of the novel without this kind of evidence. The reaction of the readers of the past reveal more precisely the aesthetic norm shared within a certain group of readers. These norms, of which novelists were well aware, were frequently not verbalized even by the critics of the time, who often took them for granted. I think the most interesting reactions to analyze are precisely those of incomprehension, puzzlement, or shock on the part of the readers of the past. These are the reactions that help us to fully grasp the aesthetic originality of a novel or its provocative ideological impact, showing us the differences between the norms proposed by new work and those to which the public was accustomed. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize that we usually tend to imagine the literary process as a linear movement from one literary phase to another, from one great author to another, from one dominant interpretation of a work to another. The history of reading obliges the scholar to imagine the literary process as non-linear, but rather as manifold. It is a plurality of communicative trajectories that develop at different rhythms. The study of past readers obliges the scholar to think at any given time of a literary situation in terms of the simultaneous coexistence of different temporalities. They are represented by the tastes and the preference of different interpretive communities and groups of readers who often read the same text at the same time, but according to aesthetic models and literary canons that belong to different eras. Beyond the struggle of the literary schools, underlined by Tignanov and by Bourdieu, the scholar has to take into account the struggle between the schools of readers, because the author bears in mind the dynamics of his public no less than those of his competitors. In our book, a fundamental contribution to reconstructing the literary canon of the Russian public come from Alexei Vdovin and Roman Lyebov, who have analyzed the evolution of the scholastic canon and of the literary tastes of the students of the Russian school between 1814 and 1917. Some chapters written by Daria Hitrova, Jonathan Stone, and Roman Timienchik analyzed poetic reading practices and the ways of constructing the sense of the poetic text in different stages of the 19th century. Abraham Reiblatt has studied the evolution in the tasting and the reading practices of the peasant world up until the beginning of the 20th century. Certain case studies, such as the one written by Susan Smith-Peter, concentrated on the formation of the first provincial public in the town of Kazan at the beginning of the 19th century. Catherine Bowers has analyzed the impact of the Gothic novel on Russian readers. So we would like to sincerely thank these authors, along with others whom I have not named, for their greatly appreciated contribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Damiano and Raffaella. We will turn now to our subsidiary, Yukiko Tatsumi.
Yeah, hello from Japan. I'm very glad to join the seminar as a Sabisieznik today. The 3 volumes edited by Professor Vanessa and Professor Rebecchini, the second volume of which we featured today, are really significant for the historical study of Russian publishing and reading. It is because, firstly, they would give us a general view of the history of Russian publishing and reading, because the volumes totally cover the Russian history from the Enlightenment period, the period before and after the Great Reforms, the Soviet era, then to the present day in the third volume. It is significant because, secondly, they show very excellent methodologies. Every article let us know the types of sources which would give us the socio-cultural insights, as today Raffaella talked. Moreover, their focusing on reading would deepen our understanding of the Russian cultural history in a very stimulating way. The study of publishing history tends to analyze the intentions of sender side, maybe, such as publishers and authors, or tend to pay attention to the regulations on the publication, like censorship by the secular and religious authorities. However, books and any other publications are different from the other commodities in its nature. So, as you know, they are read by individual readers who would process the information and would show some reactions to the reality outside the text. Therefore, it is inevitable for the book study to analyze the perception of the readers as well, although it's never an easy task. In this second volume of this series, Tatiana Golovina really successfully described the motives, hopes, and discouragements the country and owners had from their reading on the basis of their letters, diaries, and notebooks. Also fascinating were Professor Rebecchini's chapter and today's talk, where the marks of the foreign novels and the authors were traced in various kinds of text. And then the related figures appeared one after another. Then it is showed how their ways of perception were reflected on the norms and aesthetics in the period. Actually, I've learned many things from these articles and today's talks for my further study. And now I would like to ask two questions on the maybe scope of a kind of scope of the future study of Russian reading history. The first, reading and publishing history. The first is how translational works should be located in the overview of the Russian publishing and reading history. I asked because, for example, in Japan, in modern period, the bestseller translation of Samuel Smiles' self-help was published, but it was quite by chance when a Japanese student in the 1860s studying in England was given the original Smiles book from the acquaintance, quite by chance, accidentally, and he himself decided to translate it when he came back to Japan. But in Russia, there were the traders of foreign books since the 18th century, connected with European book markets, and probably translators worked in their way too. I think they were also already the components of Russian book culture throughout the history. So how do you think about including the suppliers of the translational works into the history of Russian publishing? The second question is about the history of emotions. So both of you very excellently showed the novel readers' emotion behind their reading habits, and it would meet the growing interest on emotions. So how about the reading of non-literary works that is usually considered not so much emotional? And actually, I have worked on such kinds of publication, imperial publications so far. Do you think we need to some extent to adjust the methodology for the affective tone? Those are my questions. That's all. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you very much, Yukiko, for these remarks, and thank you enormously to Damiano and Raffaella for presenting this important work. I think perhaps Damiano and Raffaella want to respond to the subsidnic's remarks, and then we'll open the floor to questions.
Yes, thank you, Yukiko, for your very interesting question. And it is really a crucial point, the point that you are doing. So the relationship between reading translations and reading foreign novels in original language. So how could we locate the translation in the publishing market and the publishing arena? And I think, as you mentioned, translations were part of the literary production, and also in Russian, for instance, students were used to do translations in order to practice their knowledge of foreign languages. For instance, in the first volume, we have a very interesting chapter by Katia Kislova, where she analyzed the reading of the students of seminary, of ecclesiastical seminary. And there we see that translations were part of their way of studying languages, of familiarizing with the foreign text. So it is true that, and also if we, for instance, if we think about Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, it was supposed to make translations. So translating is a part of the activity of a student, and it is, of course, so I think that there is a sort of split in the reading public between those who could read novels in original foreign languages, for instance, the courtiers, the high aristocrat, or also some landowners, some provincial landowners. I remember in Galavina's chapter, there is one of the two landowners who noticed that Paul de Kock novels translated into Russian are much more vulgar than those in French. And this also noticed, Bielinski also noticed that. So it is important to keep in mind that the translations are part of the literary production, but you can find very different stylistic layers inside this translation. And for instance, Vadim Vatsuro analyzed the translation of Gothic novels, of Radcliffe novels in Russian, and found out that you can find there different kind of styles that you can trace back to the mid 18th centuries. So in the Russian translation, there is a sort of coexistent of different stylistic layers from different periods and different eras. And this is why it is important to think of a literary situation in terms of coexistence of different temporalities. Not only if we consider the taste of provincial readers, but also if we consider the style inside these translations. I hope I've answered to your question.
Thank you. Raffaella, would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you very much, Yukiko, for your interesting questions. What about your second question about the possibility to include not literary works in the history, in this study of the history of the emotions? I think you're right, and I agree with you. And some of the chapters in our 3 volumes were dedicated not only to literary works, but also to, for example, to reading journals, reading newspapers. For example, there is a wonderful chapter by Jeffrey Brooks in the third volume. And what about the second volume devoted to the 19th century? Abraham Reitblatt, for example, in his 2 chapters, talks about what in his chapter about what peasants read. He talks about peasants who read also practical text or religious text and so on. And we focused on literary works, but I do think that a more complete history of reading in Russia should include other kinds of text. I don't know, for example, I am particularly interested in the newspapers at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And I'm interested in how mass media, literally mediated the image of some writers. For example, people read about Tolstoy in newspapers, but maybe they didn't even read anything by Tolstoy, but they got acquainted with him, with his image about through the media, through the newspapers. And so they created a particular image of him and of his works through the newspapers. So it would be very interesting to broad our study, our analysis, and to include also other kinds of text depending on the periods. For example, at the end of the 19th century, it could be newspapers, but also religious text or practical text. So thank you for your question, very interesting.
Thanks again to all 3 of you. And now we can open the floor to questions. Sasha will moderate and help keep things in.
I would like also to add a few words to what Raffaella replied to Yukiko about the emotional turn. One of the things that has been more difficult is to analyze, for instance, the emotional effect of reading religious text. There are very, very scarce, very, very rare evidence about how people read religious text and what were the emotional effects of the spiritual literature. So this is an entire area of research that will be open in the future. And we hope that the scholar will join us in this and will try to address this issue, because we do believe it is a crucial issue in the understanding of the Russian social life and cultural life of the 19th century. So thank you very much for this very interesting question.
Looks like we have a question from Hilda Hugenboom. Hilda, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yes, good morning. Thank you so much for this incredibly rich window into your incredibly rich work. And this is a series that we're going to be reading for a long time, I think, and responding to, because it just opens up so many avenues of thinking. So I have a question and a comment. So you talk a lot about the performance of reading, but it's really mostly private reading. You mentioned public reading, But in a lot of the documentary evidence that I've come across, there's a lot of public reading. And the Tolstoys, this was part of how Tolstoy wrote, by reading what he had written. We know this for the Kreutzer Sonata, for example. Nadezhda Klaszinskaya, when her work was published, the family would read it out loud and as part of the publication process. And you mentioned the fan mail, and so I bring to you a very curious instance of fan mail. So Klaszinskaya received letters from a woman named Catherine, who thought Klaszinskaya was a man because her pseudonym was Krastovsky. And so Klaszinskaya had cards engraved, and she corresponded with Catherine in her role as a male writer for some time. So this is in the archives. So an instance of fan mail to a woman writing under a male pseudonym. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilde, for your question and for your reflection about the reading practices. And you're right that public readings are particularly relevant, especially in certain periods. For instance, during 1860s, Raffaella wrote about the public readings made by Dostoevsky or other authors, and the strong emotional impact they had on the public. And you're right that there are so many different collective reading practice, so many different practices of collecting readings. There were, of course, salon readings, family readings, village readings, and they all had a different history, a different evolution. And it is important to keep in mind that in any single socioeconomic group, these practices were interpreted in a different way. So you're right that the public readings have an important space in this history, although we also have to keep in mind that the state played an important role in controlling the public readings. So in a way, we can't find a public sphere as the one which has been described by Habermas in Russia for a long time, especially because the role of the state as a controller of this of the public space and of the public readings. If, for instance, we take the case of the Petrashevsky circle, this is a case where something that could be a public sphere in the terms that has been described by Habermas, well, it failed to develop in Russia. It couldn't be the case because of the state control, because of the censorship and so on. So there were very few public spaces for open debates until 1860s. We just have, for instance, the cafe, some cafe houses, circulating libraries, but these didn't encourage public discussions. So we can't talk about a public sphere at that time. And in a way, the private dimension of reading, it seems to me more relevant, especially because of the omnipresent state control. So reading was more a private hidden practice because of the state control. Probably Raffaella want to add something about the letters to the authors.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for this interesting example of fan mail. I didn't know about that. I just want to add a few words about public readings. In the previous volume, we published the volume on reading in Russia in 2014, and it was included a chapter on public readings in the 60s. And so I think that it's an interesting practice, but it has some specific characteristics. First of all, it is not always, it's very difficult to reconstruct these public readings through memoirs or diaries, to reconstruct the voice of the writer, how he read, or his gestures. Or another difficulty is to understand what he actually read, because the text for the public readings were adapted, were changed by the authors. So it is not always possible to establish what this public heard. But it's a very, very interesting practice. And I think it is very important, especially in order to understand the particular atmosphere of the era of the Greek reforms in the 60s and then in the 70s. So there were real stars of these public readings. For example, Dostoevsky and Turgenev were the two stars of this public reading organized by the Literary Fund. And I think it is a topic that requires further research, further analysis. So thank you for your question.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the other two volumes, how the whole series is shaped.
Yes, of course. We have the first volume. Actually, it was the last one who has been published, probably most difficult, especially because we had to write the introduction. So to try to summarize and to have the conclusions of all this project. And the first volume start with a chapter describing how it would be possible to write a history of reading before the 17th century. And after that, we have quite a lot of chapters devoted to the 18th century. And also, I found extremely stimulating a chapter by Simon Franklin about reading the streets, is called this chapter, reading the streets. And Simon Franklin take three different moments of the in the Russian history, the beginning of 18th century, the 1830s of the 19th century, and then in the Stalin era, and he describes how people could read the street signs, the Vivieski, and also the emotional effect that all these signs played on people walking on the street, and this kind of text reading is defined by Simon Franklin as graphosphere. Graphosphere is all the text that you can see in the public sphere. I think this is a very interesting part of this work. And the last volume is about it covers the period from the Bolshevik Revolution to nowadays. And I think that there are chapters by Dabrienka and Reblat, by Jeffrey Brooks, Thomas Lahusen, a very interesting work about reading in Stalin time. Also, Denis Kozlov wrote a wonderful chapter about reading during the Tao. And also there are 3 chapters devoted to reading in today's Russia. For instance, one about reading digital text, which is, I think, a very interesting issue, especially because we are the testimony of a real revolution in reading. So it's a new revolution of reading that come up with the digital text. So I hope there will be an interest also in these other 2 volumes.
I would like just to add that in this 3rd volume and in these 3 chapters dedicated to the reading in Russia today, authors, 3 authors provide interesting examples of how certain practices of reading of the past are still alive today. For example, the collective reading, the shared reading. So it's an evidence that some practices, the main way Russians used to read in the past are still alive. So they still read in that way. I saw the reply, Hilde's reply, that she meant collective reading, groups reading. Some examples of collective readings are contained in Abraham Reit-Blatt's chapters in the 2nd volume. But it's true that it's a practice that which we didn't focus on, not because we didn't want, but because it was difficult to find. In some occasions, it was difficult to find authors who could write these chapters. So we had to renounce to some topics, which remained out of this work, but which can be analyzed, which should be analyzed in the future.
For instance, we wanted to include a chapter about reading in all believers communities, and we asked several authors, but at the end we didn't get anything, and that was a bit disappointing. And I think in the future that could be an interesting issue to analyze how was conceived the reading inside these closed communities of old believers. And of course, their reading practices were different from those of Orthodox readers and so on. So it seems to me that we tried to give an overview of the history of reading, but there is enough space for research for quite a lot of other volumes. So it's an open research field. And for instance, I'm sure that digital humanities can provide important tools for finding new sources. Some of you might know that there is a wonderful site about ego text called Progetto, where I collected thousands of diaries. And with a group of other scholars, we are trying to develop a digital tool to investigate automatically these reading experiences in these texts. And so it's an open field to new research.
And Lounsbury, you had a comment. Please go ahead.
I have just a very basic comment and then a question. The comment was, I was wondering about, you talk about how difficult it is to study the reception of religious texts. Maybe Nadia Kitsenka's new book on confession would be a place to start. I don't know, but that could be useful. And my second point is really just a very, very general question. I'm wondering if over the course of the 19th century, do you see less attention to the materiality of the book? Is it more an issue, the material of the book, at the beginning of the century when it's basically newer, you know, when texts are just starting to circulate widely? I'm thinking like in Gogol and in other texts where they do things like, you know, use books to line pie pans, and there's this sense of the vulnerability of the printed text. Does that kind of go away as the century progresses?
Thank you, Anne, for these questions and remarks. First, about the confession. Yes, this is an extremely important issue, and I'm glad that are coming out quite a lot of new studies analyzing the confession. And this is important also because confession is an important tool also for building a sense of individuality, analyzing how people consider their sins, help the people to understand what are the specific traits of a person. And so it is interesting to see how, on one hand, reading helped to develop the sense of individuality among peasants, for instance, and at the same time how the confession, the right of the confession, on the other hand, deals with the sin of the Russian subjects. So definitely, in the book you are presenting in the next meeting it will be also an important book for working on reading, I think. The second question you asked is about the materiality of the text. And you're right that on one hand, there are certain periods when the materiality is more relevant. But on the other hand, if we consider, for instance, the Soviet time, we have a very interesting chapters about Soviet pupils studying their manuals. And we see there how important are these very, very rough illustrations in these manuals about Pushkin, for instance, illustrations about the novels, how important these very simple illustration are for the emotional effect on the pupils. So I believe that the materiality of the text, something that Roger Chartier has thoroughly analyzed, is always extremely important to keep in mind to understand the emotional effect of the text, because all the texts are made of pages, are made of paratext, are made of illustrations that in a way not only guide but also shape the interpretation of by the readers. So I believe that you're right that there are certain periods where the materiality of the text is more relevant, but at the same time it is important to keep in mind in any single reading experience what is the text made of.
Thank you, that's very helpful and very interesting about the Soviet period too. If we don't have further questions, I'd like to thank everyone and also remind everyone of an event that I forgot to mention, which Damiano just reminded me of, and that's Nadia Kitsenko, who is presenting through the Jordan Center her new book called Good for the Souls, A History of Confession in the Russian Empire. That's Monday, October 18th. And Nadia will be presenting that book in conversation with me through the Jordan Center. So you can find that on the Jordan Center website. And we really hope that you'll join us for that. Thank you all today, to all our speakers today. Thanks very much to Damiano, Raffaella, Yukiko. This was fascinating and it represents a huge amount of work. We really appreciate it. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.